It began as a faint shimmer in the sky, just another mirage over the Arizona desert. At least, that's what most people thought at first. Then the shimmer grew, solidified, and resolved itself into a smooth, iridescent craft that seemed to drink in the sunlight. It moved with an unnatural grace, slowing as it approached the ground. By the time it touched down, people were already streaming toward the site, armed with smartphones and drones to capture every moment. The media exploded. Within an hour, live feeds beamed the first images of the ship to every screen in the world. The craft's surface looked fluid, rippling with colors that shifted depending on the angle. It had no visible engines or seams, just an elegant oval shape that glowed faintly as if alive. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation. Scientists speculated about advanced propulsion systems, politicians prepared statements, and ordinary people just stared at their screens, waiting for the moment the door would open. When it did, the aliens themselves were somehow both more alien and more familiar than anyone expected. They were humanoid in outline, but composed of delicate, translucent filaments that pulsed gently with light. Their heads were elongated and smooth, tapering slightly toward the top. Though featureless by human standards, no mouths, no visible eyes. They moved with a deliberate, almost regal elegance that made them seem less like creatures and more like living works of art. The world held its breath. Then the first message arrived. The beings did not speak aloud. Instead, a kind of shared understanding blossomed in the minds of everyone nearby. Concepts, emotions, and words came together effortlessly, as if the aliens were sharing thoughts rather than sounds. Greetings, inhabitants of this world. We are the Ajuri, travelers and observers. We come in peace, seeking knowledge and cultural exchange. The initial shock wore off quickly. The aliens were polite, even curious. Over the next several hours, a small delegation of Earth's leaders, scientists, and military officials cautiously approached the vessel. They carried gifts and displays of Earth's achievements, everything from a signed copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to a collection of classic vinyl records. The Ajuri examined these artifacts with what seemed to be genuine interest, their translucent forms rippling as they hovered near. They asked questions, not in words, but through a shared mental space that made communication instant. What was the purpose of this music? Why did humans place so much importance on paper documents? The humans were eager to explain. The aliens listened, their luminous forms gently pulsing, occasionally giving off a faint hum that the humans began to interpret as a form of amusement. Everything was going well, but then someone mentioned weapons. It was inevitable, really. Every civilization needs some form of defense, and humanity's military leaders were keen to show that Earth was no pushover. At first, the Ajuri seemed merely curious, watching as demonstrations of modern technology were prepared. The humans rolled out a series of their more advanced tools: unmanned drones, guided missiles, and laser-based defense systems. Yet the Ajuri, far from being impressed, reacted with the same mild amusement they had shown when presented with a gramophone. Your advanced weapons rely on crude chemical and electronic reactions. We find them charming. The word charming did not sit well with General Maria Hargrove, who had spent her career working on what she thought were the cutting edge of military technology. She forced a smile, but clenched her jaw. The aliens' condescension only grew more pointed as the demonstration went on. The turning point came when Dr. Emil Rodriguez, a historian who had been invited to provide cultural context, unveiled a replica of an early flintlock pistol. He held it up like a prized artifact, explaining its importance in Earth's history. How? It marked the dawn of gunpowder warfare, the transition from swords to firearms. It was, he said, a revolutionary invention for its time. The Ajuri, who had been hovering silently up to that point, suddenly emitted a cascade of shimmering ripples. It took the humans a moment to realize the aliens were laughing. This object was your revolution, the Ajari leader Vrika broadcast. A small tube of metal, barely capable of piercing a modern defensive shield. How quaint! Surely you do not consider this primitive relic worthy of demonstration. Rodriguez bristled, but kept his composure. It may not look like much now, but in its day, Vrika interrupted, it was an amusing toy. Your history is colorful, if not particularly formidable. General Hargrove muttered something under her breath. Captain David Mason, a younger officer standing at the back of the group, whispered to his colleague, "If they keep laughing, I swear I'll load it and show them what it can do." He hadn't meant for anyone to hear, but Vrika's luminous form turned toward him. "Do what it can do. Are you suggesting you would fire this ancient device? Such an action would be delightful." It was a direct challenge, one the aliens didn't take seriously. To them, the human's gun was as threatening as a child's slingshot. The entire Ajari delegation radiated that same sense of dismissive amusement, and yet something about Mason's steely gaze and the weight of the pistol in his hand suggested that this encounter was far from over. The flintlock pistol may have been an artifact of a bygone era, but it was about to play a role no one, human or alien, could have anticipated. The captain's half-joking defiance lingered in the air longer than he'd intended. It was just a muttered comment, a frustrated remark made under his breath, but Vrika's shimmering form turned toward him immediately, the aliens glowing. A figure pulsed faintly, a sign Mason had learned that the creature was either amused or intrigued. Right now, it seemed to be both. "You believe this relic of metal and powder still holds power," Vrika said, broadcasting the thought into everyone's minds. Its voice had a calm, even cadence, but the rippling light along its elongated head gave the words a mocking edge. "Show us!" General Hargrove shot a sharp look at Mason. "You've already made your point, Captain," she said in a low, warning tone. "We don't need to—" "It's fine," Mason interrupted, not taking his eyes off Vrika. "If they want to see, I'll show them." There was something about the alien's calm, condescending tone that had crawled under his skin. He knew it was reckless, probably stupid. But the idea of just standing there, letting them laugh at humanity's history, felt unbearable. The other humans exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Rodriguez took a small step forward. "You should understand, Vrika," he began diplomatically. "This firearm represents a turning point in human technological history. While it may seem rudimentary now, it paved the way for centuries of innovation." "We understand," Vrika interrupted, the faint hum of amusement rippling through the air again. "But understanding the history of a toy and believing it still holds relevance are two different things. If you wish to demonstrate, proceed. We are most eager to see what impact it might have." Mason held the flintlock carefully, weighing it in his hands. He knew the design well enough. It wasn't a real antique, but a perfectly accurate replica down to the smallest detail. Rodriguez had brought it along for context, never expecting anyone to fire it. But Mason was a marksman by training. He knew how to load and shoot weapons from nearly every era, and right now he was eager to remind these shimmering aliens that even an old, primitive weapon could have a surprising amount of bite. He carefully pulled out the powder horn and measured a small amount into the muzzle. With practiced ease, he used the ramrod to push a lead ball down into place. It was a process that took time, especially compared to modern firearms, but he performed each step deliberately. The Ajari watched with faintly glowing eyes, their shimmering forms steady and still. To them it was likely as strange as watching someone churn butter by hand. Quaint, they would have called it. An outdated ritual. When the weapon was loaded, Mason raised it. A steel target had been set up about 50 yards away, something Hargrove's team had placed to demonstrate modern weapons. The captain took a deep breath, steadying his aim. The pistol felt awkward, heavy in all the wrong places. He glanced at the target, lined up the primitive iron sights, and pulled the trigger. The flint snapped, striking the steel frizzen. Sparks flew. A tiny explosion of powder erupted from the flashpan, and an instant later the main charge ignited. The loud crack echoed across the desert. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the faint sound of a metallic ping reached them as the ball struck the target. The Ajuri delegation remained silent, their luminescent forms still. They didn't laugh this time. Instead, they exchanged glances, wordless yet clearly communicating. One of them tilted its elongated head, as if trying to understand the point of the demonstration. Finally, Vrika spoke. An impressive display of combustion and kinetic energy. But what does it demonstrate? That you can project a small sphere of metal with sufficient force to strike a plate? We could replicate such an effect with a flick of our energy fields. It's not about raw power, Mason replied, lowering the pistol. It's about history. This was a breakthrough, primitive, sure, but it's what came after that matters. That small sphere of metal changed everything for us. Wars, industries, entire nations. This was the starting point. That's the point. Vrika emitted a low hum, the alien equivalent of a chuckle. A starting point, yes, but your modern weapons are so far removed from this device that it no longer holds relevance. Your people must understand that in the vast expanse of the universe, such beginnings are common. What matters is where you are now, and what we see. Now is a species clinging to its early steps, rather than embracing the full scale of possibility. Mason opened his mouth to retort, but Hargrove cut in. Thank you, Captain. That will be all. We appreciate the demonstration. The Ajuri's faint amusement remained, but there was a subtle shift in their tone, a slight undercurrent of curiosity beneath the condescension. Mason could feel it, even though Vrika didn't say anything further. The aliens had laughed at the flintlock's simplicity, but they were also, he suspected, a little puzzled. For all their advanced technology and grand pronouncements, they couldn't quite grasp why this toy still meant so much to the humans. As the delegation began to move on, Hargrove pulled Mason aside. "Don't pull a stunt like that again," she said, her voice low and firm. "We're here to make a good impression, not show off." "Yes, ma'am," Mason replied. Though he couldn't keep a hint of defiance out of his tone, he holstered the flintlock, unloaded, of course, and fell into step behind the others. He wasn't sure what had gotten into him. It wasn't like he was sentimental about old weapons, and he wasn't normally one to challenge orders, but something about the Ajuri's attitude stirred something in him, something he couldn't quite shake. As they continued toward the next exhibit, Mason cast a final glance at Vrika. The alien's glowing form hovered at the edge of the group, its attention already shifting to the next marvel of human achievement. But even as it moved away, Mason could swear it looked back, just for a moment, at the flintlock in his hand. The quiet tension that hung over the desert in the wake of Mason's demonstration wasn't something the Ajuri seemed to notice, or at least it wasn't something they openly acknowledged. Vrika and the other aliens continued their careful examinations of the humans' various technologies, their rippling forms emitting occasional faint pulses of amusement or interest. The human delegation did its best to stay professional, but the subtle condescension was getting to them. Still, Mason felt a peculiar satisfaction. The flintlock hadn't impressed the Ajuri, but it had made them pause. If nothing else, it had reminded them that humanity's strength didn't lie solely in its weapons. It lay in its ingenuity, its willingness to adapt, to start with something as crude as a metal tube and refine it until it became something entirely different, something powerful. He didn't say that out loud, of course. Hargrove was already annoyed enough, but the thought stuck with him as the group moved on. A few hours passed. The demonstrations continued. By mid-afternoon, the desert heat had settled heavily over the site, and both humans and Azuri seemed to grow sluggish. Even the aliens' shimmering light seemed to dull slightly, as if the sun's relentless blaze affected them too. That's when the shimmer appeared. At first, Mason thought it was another mirage, a heat haze rising off the sand. But this shimmer was moving. It flickered and shifted, growing more solid with each passing second. Soon it became clear that it wasn't a natural phenomenon at all. The shape resolved into something angular and black, hovering silently about 20 feet off the ground. It wasn't large, no more than the size of a small car, but its matte surface and the faint blue glow coming from its underside made it stand out starkly against the desert backdrop. "What is that?" Hargrove snapped, turning to one of the soldiers. "Was that supposed to be part of the demonstration?" "No, ma'am," the soldier replied, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. The Azuri, who had been conversing in their silent telepathic manner, stopped abruptly. Vrika's light flickered in what Mason now recognized as alarm. "This is not ours," Vrika said, its thought voice sharp and clear. "It is not of Azuri design. Be wary." The word sent a chill through Mason. The Azuri weren't concerned by human weapons. If this unknown craft worried them, it wasn't something to take lightly. The craft hovered in place for a few seconds, its blue glow growing brighter. Then it emitted a sharp, mechanical sound, like the grinding of gears followed by a piercing whine. Without warning, a pulse of energy shot out from its underside. The blast struck the ground near the group, sending up a plume of sand and smoke. Mason stumbled backward, shielding his face. When he looked up, he saw the Azuri raising their shimmering arms, generating a translucent barrier of light. "Take cover!" Hargrove barked, and the humans scattered, ducking behind vehicles and equipment. The Azuri barrier absorbed the next pulse, though it shimmered dangerously under the impact. Vrika's voice rang out in their minds again. "Defensive measures are holding, but not indefinitely. This construct is far more advanced than any we've encountered from this world. It's not from Earth," Hargrove shouted back, even as she motioned for her soldiers to prepare their weapons. "Whatever it is, we need to neutralize it before it causes more damage." Her team opened fire, their bullets and energy rounds streaking toward the black craft. The shots struck its surface, but its blue shield absorbed them easily. The humans kept firing, trying different angles, but the craft didn't seem fazed. Mason huddled behind a vehicle, watching the exchange with growing frustration. Their modern weapons weren't doing any good. The Azuri's shields were holding, for now, but it was clear they weren't used to active combat, at least not against something like this. The aliens, despite all their technological superiority, seemed to be struggling. He glanced down at the flintlock pistol on his belt. It was a ridiculous thought, he knew that. This was a state-of-the-art machine, possibly extraterrestrial itself, armed with energy weapons that could vaporize steel. Firing a single lead ball from a centuries-old design was an act of sheer desperation, and yet Mason pulled the pistol free. His movements were quick, almost automatic, pouring the powder, ramming the ball down the barrel, priming the flashpan. Every second, the black craft loomed closer, its blue glow intensifying. The others were too busy fighting, too focused on survival, to notice Mason crouching there with an antique firearm. When the pistol was ready, he stood and took aim. The black craft turned, as if sensing the motion. Mason had no time to think. He pulled the trigger. The flintlock's roar was tiny compared to the chaos around it. A puff of smoke and the sharp crack of the shot was swallowed by the sound of modern rifles and energy pulses. But the lead ball hit its mark, striking the shimmering blue field that protected the craft. And then something happened. The craft's shield flickered, just for an instant, a fraction of a second. But it was enough. The blue glow shuddered, and a strange, rippling effect spread outward from the impact point. The craft's hum faltered, and its movements became erratic. Mason blinked, stunned. He had expected the shot to do nothing, to bounce harmlessly off the shield. Instead, it had caused something. Another soldier, seeing the shields falter, fired a modern rifle round. This time, the bullet passed through, striking the craft's body with a loud metallic clang. Sparks flew. The craft wobbled, then spiraled downward, crashing into the sand with a heavy thud. For a moment, the desert was silent. The humans slowly rose from their cover. The Azuri's barrier dissolved, and they moved cautiously toward the fallen machine. Smoke and sparks hissed from its damaged frame. It wasn't completely destroyed, but it was clearly disabled. Mason lowered the flintlock, his heart still racing. He stared at the pistol in his hand, unable to process what had just happened. The shot should have been meaningless, a gesture of defiance at best. Instead, it had cracked a shield that no modern weapon could penetrate. Hargrove approached him, her face pale but steady. "Captain," she said, her voice carefully measured, "what the hell did you just do?" I don't know," Mason admitted. He looked down at the flintlock, then back at the wreckage. "I fired, and it reacted." Vrika stepped forward, its form flickering faintly. "Your weapon," it said slowly, "should not have been capable of such an effect. This is unexpected." Mason nodded, still struggling to catch his breath. "You and me both, buddy." A low breeze swept across the desert, rustling the sand and carrying the acrid tang of burnt metal. The humans and Azuri stood in a tense semicircle around the downed craft, its matte black surface sparking weakly in the sunlight. The smoke had started to thin, revealing the strange angular contours of the machine. Its faint blue glow was gone now, leaving it lifeless, but the atmosphere was far from calm. Captain Mason stared at the flintlock pistol in his hand. The weapon felt heavier now, as if the impossibility of what had just occurred had soaked into its metal frame. When he'd pulled the trigger, it had been pure impulse, an act born of frustration and instinct rather than reason. And yet, that simple lead ball had somehow caused the shield to flicker, disrupting the drone's defenses just long enough for it to be brought down. The absurdity of it all was almost too much to process. General Hargrove broke the silence, her voice sharp and tightly controlled. "I want a full analysis of this thing. Every component, every circuit. Find out where it came from and what it was doing here." Her soldiers moved cautiously toward the wreckage, scanning it with portable devices and snapping photographs. A pair of scientists in the delegation, who had been quietly observing up until now, joined the effort. Mason watched them work, but his thoughts were still on the shot. The look Hargrove had given him before barking orders was one he couldn't quite interpret. She wasn't angry. If anything, she seemed unsettled, and that made him uneasy. Vrika moved closer to Mason, its translucent form flickering faintly. The alien's presence was no longer as imposing as it had been earlier. If anything, Vrika now seemed uncertain. "Your weapon," it said, broadcasting directly to Mason's mind, "exhibited an effect we cannot immediately explain. A projectile of solid matter should not have interfered with the energy field, yet it did. It wasn't exactly intentional," Mason replied. His voice sounded smaller than he expected. "I just figured it couldn't hurt to try." Vrika's light rippled, its way of showing contemplation. "It appears we have underestimated not only your people's ingenuity, but also the value of your past. This so-called relic produced an outcome that our understanding of energy dynamics cannot account for. This has implications." Mason raised an eyebrow. "Implications like what?" "Your species is not as predictable as we believed," Vrika admitted. "You adapt in ways that are difficult to quantify. What you consider primitive, we dismissed as irrelevant. Yet the event we just witnessed demonstrates that even the simplest of your creations may have properties worth investigating. This will require further study. Mason wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or unsettled. So what? You're saying we got lucky? Perhaps, Vrika replied. But it was an instructive kind of luck. General Hargrove approached them then, her hands on her hips and her gaze fixed firmly on Mason. Captain, I'd like to have that weapon examined. Whatever happened just now, we need to understand it. Mason hesitated, his grip tightening slightly on the pistol. It's just a flintlock, ma'am. A replica. It's not special. Then handing it over shouldn't be a problem, Hargrove said. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but there was a firmness behind her words. We need to know why it worked when our modern weapons didn't. We need to rule out every possibility. Chemical, magnetic, electromagnetic. We can't afford to leave any stone unturned. Mason nodded reluctantly and handed the pistol over. Hargrove passed it to one of the scientists, who immediately set to work analyzing the barrel and residue. Mason felt oddly exposed without it, as if part of him had just been taken away. The pistol had no sentimental value. He hadn't even seen it before today, but it had just saved all of their lives, and now it was out of his hands. As the analysis began, Vrika turned toward Hargrove. Your people continue to surprise us, General. It is clear that we have misjudged you. The simplicity of your weaponry does not negate its potential. We see now that your progress is not just a straight line, but a web of innovation. Threads of knowledge that intersect and build upon each other in ways that are difficult to predict. Hargrove didn't respond immediately. She looked from the downed craft to the scientists analyzing the flintlock and then back to Vrika. We've never claimed to be perfect, she said at last, but we're resourceful. That's something. We've always known. Maybe now you're starting to see it too. Vrika gave no sign of agreement or disagreement, but the faint rippling along its form had softened. There is much we still need to understand. This incident may mark the beginning of a new phase in our relationship. If your people are willing, we would like to work more closely together, to share knowledge and study the phenomena we have just witnessed. Hargrove nodded slowly. That depends on how you treat us from here on out. If you're serious about mutual respect and cooperation, we're open to it. You have our respect, Vrika said, and this time there was no trace of mockery in its tone. You have earned it. Mason let out a small breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The shift in tone from the aliens was more than he'd expected, and he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about it. Still, it was better than outright hostility. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the humans and Azuri continued their examinations and discussions, the tension of the earlier confrontation easing into something closer to mutual curiosity. Mason stood to the side, watching it all unfold. The black drone lay inert in the sand, its mysteries still unsolved. The flintlock was now in the hands of scientists, its unexpected impact the topic of every whispered conversation. And somewhere deep in the back of Mason's mind, a single thought kept turning over. Sometimes, the simplest solutions could yield the most surprising results.